The Fallout show's been out for a while now, giving fans an opportunity to fully digest the entire story, express their thoughts, and chat about theories. But in all this time, I haven't seen a single good, convincing resolution to what I think is still the biggest continuity error in the show. And that, of course, is the date of the destruction of Shady Sands. This issue was one of the first things fans picked up on after the release of the show, which is why Todd Howard addressed it pretty soon after the release of the show. And in an interview with IGN, clarified that Shady Sands was not destroyed until after the events of Fallout New Vegas, which took place in 2281.
We're careful about the timeline. There might be a little bit of confusion in some places, but everything that happened in the previous games, including New Vegas, happened. We're threading it tight there, but the bomb falls just after the events of New Vegas.
So, great, right? End of story. One of the producers of the Fallout show has definitively said that the events of Fallout New Vegas happened before Shady Sands was destroyed. End of conversation, right? Well, not quite. Because I think it's clear that what an executive producer of the show says about what the show is trying to say might not actually be what the show is trying to say. Especially when I think these comments were made to douse the flames of controversy, to prevent it from spiraling out of control. I want to make the case that the show itself very clearly tells us that Shady Sands was destroyed in 2277, not after 2281, as Todd Howard would have us believe. But first we need to explain exactly what the big deal is. Why is this one date in any way important? Well, the short answer is that if Shady Sands was destroyed in 2277, as the show leads us to believe, then some of the major events that took place in the game Fallout New Vegas, which takes place in the year 2281, couldn't canonically have happened the way they do in the game. Before the show, Shady Sands was the capital of the NCR. It was the seat of government of the New California Republic. But the show has changed our understanding of how the NCR works a little bit. After the show, we now know that Shady Sands was just the first capital of the NCR, implying that the capital has moved and now exists elsewhere. Which is good news for the NCR, because Shady Sands was destroyed by a nuclear detonation in 2277. But how could that be possible if in the year 2281 we find not only the NCR moving into the Mojave Wasteland in force, annexing towns, and defeating entire armies? Remember, they actually defeated Caesar's Legion already in 2277 at the first battle for Hoover Dam. But also, no one from the NCR seems to know that Shady Sands has been destroyed, nor that the government of the NCR has moved from Shady Sands to someplace else. Because it's not only referred to by name in the game multiple times, but it's described as the functioning seat of government for the NCR in the game multiple times.
Something the politicians back in Shady Sands came up with.
Politicians back in Shady Sands are completely detached from the people actually living here.
So, in short, the show is telling us that Shady Sands was destroyed and the NCR's government, if it even exists at all, has moved elsewhere, outside of Shady Sands. The game is telling us that Shady Sands still exists and that the NCR's government still exists, and it exists in Shady Sands. The two can't be true at the same time. Which is why Todd Howard said what he said. The only resolution for this perceived continuity error is if Shady Sands was destroyed after the events of Fallout New Vegas. That would solve the problem, but it's not what the show is telling us, despite what Todd Howard says. And there are 3 pieces of evidence that I'm going to point to that proves this. The first, of course, is the date on the chalkboard in Vault 4. We'll cover that last. But I want to talk about 2 other pieces of evidence that I think have been overlooked. At the end of episode 5, The Past, when the credits roll, there's a short pan-out sequence. The camera pans out of a school locker. We see that the locker was inside the Shady Sands Elementary School. The elementary school is a ruin on the edge of the crater that was once Shady Sands. So clearly, this school was destroyed at the same time that the town of Shady Sands was destroyed. But what's interesting is what we find inside the book, inside the locker. We see that it's a library book, and it was first checked out in 2189. It has been checked in and out a total of 17 times. Some of the dates are incomplete, but of the dates that are complete, we see that it was checked out numerous times in the 2190s, then a long gap until it was checked out again in the 2230s, a decade-long gap until it was checked out again in the 2240s, 2 more decades until it was checked out in the 2260s. But then interest in this book picks up again in the 2270s. The library book has been returned to the library every time it's been checked out throughout its entire life, with one exception, a partially incomplete date in the 2190s. The next date it was checked out is 30 years later, which means that this book was lost for a period of 30 years. Could it have been hanging out in some child's locker for 30 years? Probably not. Maybe it was taken home and lost at home until it was found decades later and returned to the library. Or maybe the library didn't properly register its return and lost it themselves, whereupon it was found at a later date and returned to the shelves by the library staff. Incidentally, this can help explain why there were decade-long gaps between checkouts after the 2190s. If the book was lost in the 2190s, the library likely got other copies. Those copies were checked out in the 30 years between the 2190s and the 2230s, so that when this book was finally returned, the children had numerous other copies to choose from, so that this copy was checked out less frequently, once every couple of decades. At any rate, it was eventually returned, whereupon it was checked out again in the 2230s. But in 2276, it was never returned. And that's because it's still in this kid's locker. If Shady Sands was destroyed in 2277, this would make sense. Some kid at the elementary school checked out this book from the library in November and kept it for the better part of the school year until school was abruptly canceled by a nuclear detonation that destroyed Shady Sands. But it wouldn't make sense if Shady Sands was actually destroyed in 2281, because then that would mean that this book sat not in a library, but in a kid's locker for 5 years after it was checked out, before Shady Sands was destroyed sometime after 2281. This scene is intentional. The showrunners are continuing to tell their story even during the credit sequences of the show. This scene was purposeful. It was intentional. What was this scene trying to tell us? Was it trying to tell us that something dramatic happened to Shady Sands in 2281? Well, if it was trying to say that, it did a poor job of doing so, because the library check-in and check-out dates end 5 years before 2281. Is this scene trying to tell us that something terrible and dramatic happened close to the year 2277? Yes, it is. The next piece of evidence we have brings us back to a previous episode when Lucy and the ghoul met Roger inside the West Side Medical Clinic. Now, on the surface, this scene appears to be about the topic of cannibalism, because the ghoul is cannibalizing a corpse. Lucy is disgusted and outraged by this, and she's trying to make an argument that cannibalism is not necessary for survival. In order to make this argument, she taps into her memory about her own past in the vault.
In the Great Plague of 77, people starved, my mother included. Everyone had to quarantine. They couldn't work the farms together. My dad dropped to 128 pounds, and he still refused to do anything like this.
Let's break this down into its component parts. According to Lucy, in Vault 33, there was a Great Plague In 2277, everyone had to quarantine. No one was working the farms. They were all in their own homes for an extended period of time. It was during this Great Plague that Lucy's mother died. She starved to death because there was no food because no one was working the farms. And finally, Lucy's father dramatically lost a lot of weight. Lucy is telling the ghoul that her father was able to survive without resorting to cannibalism, but the ghoul picks up on something that Lucy didn't.
As what people say they did, and what they really did.
Now, there could have been a Great Plague of 2277. The residents could have all quarantined at this time, and many people could have starved to death. All of that is completely plausible. But one of these things is impossible. And as a consequence, everything else in this story needs to be reinterpreted. And that's Lucy's mom starving to death. It was during this plague, according to Lucy, that her mother died of starvation. But we know from the finale of the show that that's not how her mother died.
My mother. What happened to her?
I think you know.
Her mother did not die of starvation. Her mother was turned into a feral ghoul when Shady Sands was destroyed because she was in Shady Sands when it was destroyed. So Rose could not have died from starvation. Someone lied to Lucy here. So if Rose wasn't even in the vault during the quote-unquote Great Plague of 2277, if she was in Shady Sands, how do we interpret the rest of Lucy's story here? Her father lost a lot of weight, and that's not some story that was told to her. She likely, as a child, saw her father emaciated. She remembers what he looked like after losing all of that weight. So how did he lose all that weight? Well, he lost that weight while he was destroying Shady Sands. We learn from the finale of the show that it was Hank McClane and Betty who physically left Vault 33 and physically traveled to Shady Sands in order to retrieve Rose and Norm and Lucy.
But then her husband came after her, and when she decided not to return home, he took the children and he burned that city to the ground.
We know that Lucy was physically outside of the vault because she has memories of feeling the heat from the sun.
Up until I was 6, I really thought that the big light on our farm was the sun. My mom used to take me to play out under that light, and I swear I could feel the sun baking my skin.
So in 2277, Rose was in Shady Sands, Norm and Lucy were in Shady Sands, Betty and Hank had traveled to Shady Sands. But being unable to convince his wife to return to Vault 33, Hank managed to retrieve Lucy and Norm, and then Hank and Betty somehow destroyed Shady Sands with a nuke.
Betty, when my mother died, what happened to her pit boy?
It was buried with her.
How are you so sure?
Because I buried her myself. Me and your father.
Turning Rose into a feral ghoul in 2277. That's a crazy expedition. It would have taken a really long time, weeks or months. How could Hank and Betty have spent so long away from Vault 33 without anyone else in the vault realizing it? Without none of them knowing that their vault door had been opened? Without none of them knowing that their overseer had been missing? Well, only if they were all quarantined. If everyone in Vault 33 was quarantined in their rooms, no one was working the farms. No one would have seen Hank and Betty leave. No one would have seen Hank and Betty return with Norm and Lucy. This scene is telling us that there was no plague of 2277. The plague of 2277 was a lie manufactured by Hank McClane so that he could leave the vault, to provide him with a cover story to explain why he returned having lost so much weight. Hank and Betty didn't just destroy Shady Sands and kill everyone in that town and kill Rose McClane, but they also killed residents in Vault 33 who starved to death thinking that there was a plague when there wasn't. So this scene isn't about cannibalism. It isn't even about a plague. It's about the destruction of Shady Sands. And Lucy gives us a date that did not originate in Vault 4, a date that originated from her own memory, 2277. Which brings us to the final piece of evidence, which we've covered in previous videos, which everyone has talked about already, and that of course is the date on the chalkboard in Vault 4. The chalkboard in Vault 4 is showing us a history of the NCR. Many of the residents in Vault 4 were survivors of the destruction of Shady Sands. The reason this timeline is on a chalkboard in a school is because the survivors are teaching their children about their own cultural history. The timeline starts in 2142 when Shady Sands was founded. It then proceeds to go through many of the dates that fans of the games are familiar with. The show gets all of these dates right. But at the very end, we see the fall of Shady Sands in 2277, and then an arrow pointing at a nuclear detonation. Now, some have argued that this means the nuclear detonation happened after the fall of Shady Sands. Well, that would make sense if this chalkboard was a flowchart, not a timeline. But it's not a flowchart. It's giving us points of time on a line. The arrow on this line is not telling us that the detonation happened after 2277. It's showing us how the fall of Shady Sands happened in 2277. But this is, of course, open to interpretation. And some have argued that this chalkboard is trying to tell us that the fall of Shady Sands started in 2277, leading up to a nuclear detonation, which isn't dated here. You'd think it would be in a classroom where they're giving us the points of time for all of the other major events in NCR's history, but the detonation itself is just not dated, but we know from Todd Howard that it must have happened after 2281. Well, it's possible, but what's the most likely explanation? Because after all, again, the producers of the show created this scene to convey storyline information to us. What were they trying to tll us? If they were trying to tell us that Shady Sands was destroyed in 2281, this is a bad way of doing so because the date 2281 isn't even here. Individually, each of these pieces of evidence might be able to be explained away. Maybe the chalkboard really is a flowchart and not a timeline. Maybe the book really did sit in a locker in an elementary school for 5 years before it was destroyed. Maybe there really was a plague of 2277 and her memories of feeling the sun on her back actually came as a much older girl. Since if that were true, her mother would have had to have left the vault in 2281. Possible, but when we have 3 of them, and the one unifying thing between the 3 is the date 2277, I find it increasingly difficult to believe what Todd Howard says, that Shady Sands was really destroyed after the events of Fallout New Vegas in 2281. As I said at the beginning of this episode, there's what the producers of the show are telling us and what the show itself is telling us. And the two are not compatible. They can't be true at the same time. Now there's one final thing. Maybe this is intentional. Maybe the showrunners have some amazing story reveal that we're not gonna get until season 2 that's gonna make sense of all of this. I can't possibly think what that could be, but perhaps this isn't an error at all, and perhaps we just don't have the complete information. And if that's the case, then we can just wait with bated breath until season 2 finally solves this conundrum. Until then, I can't help but conclude that this is an actual, real continuity error. But those are just my thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. I publish new Fallout videos each and every week on my channel, so if you don't want to miss my next one, be sure to subscribe and to click that bell notification button. If you have already but you feel like you're missing out on YouTube notifications, consider following me on Twitter at Oxhorn. I update Twitter manually with every new piece of content that I publish. I've got a plush for sale. It's in stock and ready to ship, but supplies are limited and I'm almost sold out. If you want to make sure you get your hands on one before I am, snag one today. I've also got a shirt shop with completely unique designs that you can't find anywhere else. My designs come on shirts in a variety of men's, women's, and children's sizes and in a wide array of colors. You can find them on other products as well, like smartphone cases, pillows, posters, mugs, stickers, prints, etc. So if interested, you can find a link to my shop in the description below, or you can click here. If you like what I do and you want to support me in another way, consider becoming a patron on Patreon or a member here on YouTube. YouTube members get little badges that appear next to their names in the comment sections of my videos, and they gain access to Ox emojis that they can use in my video comments and in the live chats of my live streams. But more than anything, I'm just so glad you're here watching this video with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon with more brand new videos.